and welcome to this session on the power of open innovation in the life sciences and business. And my name is Theresa, Norn. I'll be your moderator today. And with us, we have a distinguished speaker, Niclas Nilsson. Niclas is head of open innovation at Pharma, and he has been pioneering new ways of working in R&D and innovation for a very long time. And Niclas, welcome. And I think first we just simply open by saying, as just mentioned, please ask questions. We can see them when they pop up. You're free to ask questions along the way, and we'll take them. But Niclas, first, start by telling us a little bit about what is about open innovation in life sciences.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and happy to be here. And I also like to just reiterate that please ask us questions, then we can give you some better answers. And also, so open innovation is a lot of things, and sometimes some very specific things. And in the pharma industry, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit first. So in general, in the pharma industry, we rely heavily on internal innovation. And we've been doing that for a long time with a process that is pretty much closed, with confidentiality and secrecy and so forth. But since a couple of decades, we've been running a bit dry in the R&D pipeline, realizing that we more and more rely on external input to fuel our pipeline. And that could be early biotechs, that could be other pharma companies, that could be science from universities and academia, something else that can help us advancing our science to become products and treatment for patients. But getting new things into our secret labs is difficult because no one really knows what we're doing. So a different approach to doing the traditional closed pharmaceutical R&D would be to do an open pharmaceutical R&D process. And you can open up your R&D facilities in different ways. I can give you some examples, but what we've done specifically is that we open up our research facilities to other partners, biotechs, universities, and so forth, who work with similar things that we like to advance to the clinic. And for us, that is pretty much getting molecules, chemistry, antibodies, or other things that can help work against inflammation in the skin, which is what we do at Pharma. So partners here are now we open up the lab saying what kind of lab facilities we have. We give free access to external parties to come to these and utilize our facilities, or actually at least the resources we have, and then give away the data and the science, and we take away all the business restraints in that partnership and try to focus on exploring science together. So the thing that is open here is that you can decide to disclose what you do and make it more easy and relevant for external partners to come in and provide something that is relevant for you. So that is the first step of openness, actually being transparent of what you do and what you like to achieve. And the second part to make that work is also to be more open in the way how you conduct business. So in a way, open innovation is actually more like a new business model, indicating that you can actually work collaboratively in different ways, perhaps not making traditional claims on IPR, intellectual property rights, or the business commercialization of what you find. So by removing traditional business restraints and legal terms, you can open up and do so much more than what you could do otherwise.
When you're talking about opening up the secret lab and not talking about IPR and patenting, it sounds like a very different story from what you normally hear from the pharma industry. How big of a change is this in terms of ways of working? Is it a sort of evolutionary change, or are we talking a larger scale paradigm shift in how you work?
It is very different, and you will not find many pharma companies working in this manner. However, you will find many other industries working in this manner. Software industry, consumer industries, they have to open up in order to be competitive and innovative and getting close to the customers and the providers. So in a way, conceptually, it's not that far away. But in business terms, it's really, really difficult. And I usually call it business as unusual to kind of emphasize that we turn things upside down. But I think it's actually required. And I would be surprised if we don't see in the near future, many more companies opening up their explorative research or R&D facilities to be able to connect to the ecosystem. And that ecosystem is represented here today. There's so many startups, entrepreneurs, students, driving forces, investors that can do so much more for what you do if you just open up and be more transparent of how that can actually help you. So it is really difficult. I've been working on this for quite a few years, and I think it is a step-by-step change. But you have to keep in mind the longer goal, and then you can keep taking those steps. Yeah. But very few pharma companies are doing this, but I predict many more will do so. Yeah. Because they will rely on assistance, such as from you, to drive the pipeline forward in future.
But actually, that brings us to the first question that we have from our audience. Because you're talking about this ecosystem of suppliers, collaborators, competitors, investors, startups. Our first question is, what are the biggest challenges in creating sort of an innovation ecosystem around a corporate R&D laboratory, essentially, and how have you addressed it?
Yeah, a good question, and I think it's the whole word of ecosystem is kind of new actually, and we don't usually address it, but it's a good one because it kind of emphasizes that we are all in it together. And sometimes when I present and have slides with me, I show a big picture of a coral reef outside the Barrier Reef in Australia, and it shows a great ecosystem of fish, coral reefs, and all kinds of entities and animals living together. And if you take one out of the equation, many more will suffer. So they all rely on each other. And the ecosystem kind of shows that you are one part of something bigger. And the pharma companies, they have been able to survive much by themselves in the past, but now more and more they're going to have to rely on innovation from biotechs, startups, universities, spin-outs, students, and they have to relate to that ecosystem. So I think maybe you shouldn't actually create an ecosystem. You should address it and embrace it and realize that you are a part of the ecosystem. And if you want to get something from the ecosystem, this is when it gets difficult. You have to provide something to the ecosystem. And if you're transparent and if you give up some restraints and you provide resources to the ecosystem, then you will get something back. So we did that, but I will give one more specific answer also to the difficulty. One thing that perhaps we underestimated was from a pure marketing perspective. So even though if you open up a door, no one will use it if you don't know it exists. So getting the word out, what you do and how it can create value for someone else is actually a significant issue to get the ecosystem to work. So platforms that connect partners from a non-specific perspective would be really critical, and we don't actually have that.
Follow up a little bit on one of the questions we just got, actually the last question is the future value of the pharma industry in owning the ecosystem or in being part of the ecosystem? Because I mean, obviously you're crucial anchor organizations and there's a whole system that orients itself around it. What is, as you say, you're part of an ecosystem, but you're obviously a very influential, very strong part of it. Can you own an ecosystem? Do you have different ecosystems around different pharma companies, different specialty areas, or is that a bit of an illusion that you can even try and own an ecosystem in any way?
It will be difficult to own it. I think many probably will, to begin with, try to own it because that's the standard approach from the pharma industry. They will go in and try to take ownership. But I think what the pharma industry can do is actually provide something for the ecosystem and make it work. So coming back to my previous answer a little bit. So in pharma industry, because they tend to have a little bit more resources than a biotech, who are a bit more restrained on what they can do, the pharma industry can probably provide the ecosystem and therefore make it work. I think that could be a really important role for the pharma industry in order to then to reap the benefits and get something out of it.
Before we get to one of the next questions, when you're establishing this type of ecosystem, I mean, it's already there. I mean, the organizations are there, the companies are there, the investors are there, startups that are. What's different about an open innovation ecosystem? I mean, because it must change the dynamics of the system somehow, or the requirements to be part of the system. Do the entry barriers increase, or are there different things that you need to do to be able to function the system where there's increasing openness in R&D processes?
So if I understand it correctly, the difference between a traditional ecosystem and then maybe an ecosystem that is driven or fueled by open innovation, so to speak. Yes, so first of all, open innovation is a large term, and I kind of put it in the business model kind of term. You have open science, and open source, and open data, and open access, all kind of more specific terms that will help make open innovation work. Sharing the data, maybe not kind of owning the IPR of it and so forth, sharing resources, being transparent about the science and what you know. So an open ecosystem will be much more fast. It will be like an well-oiled machinery. because we all have cogwheels that want to click together, right? The biotech and the pharma company, and the patients, and the physicians, and the investors, and the payers. The openness can provide an oil to that machinery to make it work faster. So it can probably do what it does anyhow, but to get more things out of it, it will help also simply the matchmaking process. So the way we see open innovation is we actually built the platform because we want to make a quicker and better and more relevant match to biotechs that have something for us. And therefore we provide something so then they can come to us. So an open innovation-based ecosystem will be faster and better for all parties in it. But it also requires that you do embrace it and not just try to use it, because then it won't work, in my experience at least.
In terms of establishing and developing this ecosystem, one of the questions I received is technology enabling this innovation process in any way? Does technology play a role in supporting open ties, open collaboration in the way that you're working at the moment?
A good question. So how is technology enabling the innovation process? I think yes and no, to give a simple answer. Technology will be a catalyst to the innovation process, but the most important aspect of innovation is value creation. And that means you need to know how you do something that becomes valuable for someone else. That is innovation. Sometimes we ask the question to other institutions, we say, do you have innovation? Yes, we do. We have R&D, they say. R&D, research and development, doesn't have to be innovation. Innovation, R&D, can be applied to create innovation, but you need to know your customer needs, your patient needs, where to create the value. If you know where to create the value, technology will be a great catalyst to get to that point. And there's so many opportunities in technology, but we'll take that on a different stage, I think.
We had some other questions as well that'd be quite relevant. If we get the questions back on the screen. I think one of the questions was, are there, again, speaking of technology, I think of crowdsourcing is one of the ways that some pharmaceutical companies have been opening up some of the problems that they're working with. But have you had any examples of problems that you have invited startups to help you solve? Are there any ways in which you sort of try and guide the companies that could be interested in working with you in a direction that could be relevant and provide an entry point?
So can you give an example of a problem you have invited startups to solve? I guess, yes. What we have right now, working in Lea Pharma Open Innovation, is an open question to anyone who has new ways of reducing inflammation in the skin. And we then allow them to come to us and test these things, molecules or whatever they are, in our systems to see if we can find someone who has some new way to reduce inflammation in the skin. So that is something we have up and running right now. Another specific kind of problem was a couple of years ago, because it was the first hackathon that I was part of designing. And that was when we were in the beginning of realizing maybe AI is something that we need to use, because everyone needs to have an AI strategy plan and work on it, and you're not cool if you don't. So we said, well, how do we actually put that into use? And we said, well, we don't know. We're not AI experts. And at the same time, we needed desperately find new ways to treat eczema patients. And if you look at the literature in the science, we kind of ran out of drug targets for eczema. So we said, well, why don't we combine finding new drug targets with exploring AI? So we have an open hackathon kind of challenge saying, why don't you come to us and use an explorative AI tool and prove to us that you can find new drug targets using AI as a tool for potential treatments of eczema? So problems can be very specific. They can be platform-based, they can be technology-focused. But I would also like to add that finding a good problem that is suitable for externalization and openness is really difficult. Much more than I would actually think from the beginning. So if you're thinking about opening up or creating a problem or a challenge for someone, you really, really need to spend a lot of time trying to understand the problem, understand how you can create value on that problem, and understand how you phrase that problem for someone who doesn't work with this. And this is really, really difficult. And then at the end, it's also difficult to evaluate things that you don't know anything about. But that's another part. But that is really difficult, and I will not underestimate that. So also understand that if you're trying to then perhaps work with someone else's problem, which is going to be much more of a normal way to find partnership nowadays, realize that the problem might not actually be exactly what I think it is, and what you interpret to be might not be exactly what you think it is. So be open-minded to that, and maybe add some questions to that if you want to work with it, because problems are really hard to define.
So the problems are hard to define, but one of the questions that we have is, are there any specific areas that you'd like to even see addressed on a general level within open innovation? Examples mentioned research, digital genomics.
Yes.
Are there any areas that you can sort of help people to zoom in on in case they want to somehow engage with
Yes,
open
okay,
innovation?
one good example. Actually, I like the one, both research, digital and genomics. Both those things are great. So I think in general, the areas that could really benefit from openness are the ones that are difficult to make sense of. Right now, we have difficulty finding people who can help us dig into big data sets, understanding, real-life data sets, and making sense of all this. And I think that could be potentially a good challenge to kind of give out to external partners. But it's difficult, though, because you need to phrase what is it you actually like to achieve with it. And sometimes you put out a big data set and say, well, why don't you help us find something? And that is not a good way of doing it. But genomics, because of the size of the data, absolutely. And particularly if you can combine genomics maybe with demographics data or something else. Because I think openness here and the value you can create with openness and is based on transdisciplinary activities. So when you combine something with something else, then it makes a lot of sense. And especially if you come from a company, then maybe you don't have those two expertise in-house. But if you can combine those, that would be a really great example of an open innovation approach. So genomics, big data, digitalization, it has to be more specific in that case because it's such a large word, right? And there's a side comment because digitalization doesn't solve a problem specifically. It's a great tool to solve something else. And I think that's something else is where you should start to understand. But genomics, big data sets, and also up and coming is drug target discovery and pretty much all kind of preclinical work. Because nowadays it's easier to create an IPR distance between clinical work and preclinical work. So the early stuff that you don't necessarily have to patent in the same way is more suitable for an open and non-IPR controlled approach.
Because that actually brings us to one of our questions is, at which point in the development phase, when you're in an open innovation process, do you start to take out patents? Because, I mean, traditionally, you're thinking, you want to patent as early as possible, protect your rights, even though there may be a long way to market, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. But it sounds from what you're saying that the point in time at which you start talking about patenting is shifting, in a sense. So when do you start to actually discuss IPR and involve that?
So is that a second question?
The second question, yes.
Or we're going to open innovation at what? Yeah. It depends, of course, on what you... on the company or institution and so forth. Open innovation can be applied in different kind of, if you look at the whole process from finding an idea to the clinic, that's a long process in R&D. It takes 10, 15 years and costs at least $1 billion. You can apply open innovation to different parts of that process. And if you cut it into pieces, it's easier to address that from an IPR perspective than looking at the whole picture. So what we do, we open up access and transparency to some of our advanced in vitro assays in the laboratory. And then you can say, well, why do you do that? Isn't that like something that creates a competitive edge? Yes, it is, if you're in the business of selling in vitro assays. Yeah. But we're in the business of finding solutions for patients, so we can be more open in that segment. And when we move out of that segment, then we have to look at IPR and patent, because our business model in pharma requires us to be able to patent, otherwise we can't commercialize and get return of the R&D investments. So it depends on the industry, but in pharma, I would say when you start to develop, that's when it gets really important to have a patent, or at least protect your IPR in one way or another. And patent itself is really interesting to talk about, and I think we're going to see something happening there in the future, because patents has become like a protector and something that makes it difficult to work together, when it should actually be the opposite. Patent has been created to protect that what you do is actually useful by someone else, but you will actually be able to benefit from that innovation. So I think to get a more flexible approach to patent is probably necessary as well.
That makes a lot of sense from the point of a pharmaceutical company. But given that you'll be working often probably small companies who may be engaging in R&D and things that could potentially be patentable, be a source of new products or services, one of the questions is how do investors perceive the concept of open innovation? So let's say a startup engages with you in the development of a technology that's not patented.
It's a good one.
And you've signed on into this room of pre-competitive collaboration, and no IP space. But you know that down the line, you will need to get some investors to put money into your company and your product and secure the rights. Because you, of course, as a company, you will have lead time advantages, secrecy advantages, tacit knowledge that will give you a head start. But for the smaller company, maybe you have an issue. So could this create any kind of issues for the companies working with you in this open innovation ecosystem?
Yes, it can. And you have to be aware of course. And there's models to also deal with this. And actually, the model that we designed specifically addresses this issue, because when we talk to partners with the open innovation process, we do not actually look at what they have. So even though we don't claim any IPR, the partner don't tell us what they have. So it's actually confidential, because it can be. We look for functionality. So when a biotech comes to us and we work with them, their molecule, the gold nugget that we respect, is of no risk of being exposed and become non-patentable. So they can take the data we generate and they can patent what they have based on that data. So we built that system in order to truly respect and so that biotechs will trust us when working with us, because we know that it's a problem. So I think knowing IPR, when to use it and when not to use it, is going to be really important. And we recognize it is really important for the startups and biotechs to maintain the possibility of protecting and commercializing their innovation. Absolutely.
So you're opening the space for collaboration, but you're also preserving the respect for that some companies may need to protect appropriate their investments.
But sadly, in some way, sometimes there are completely open systems, and I know there's a couple of platforms like open source malaria. They design new drugs for malaria, but their kind of setup is upfront, put everything on the internet, nothing can be patentable, but then they create a really, really great academic kind of ecosystem that everyone shares everything and no one can patent anything, which works for them, right? But it doesn't work to create a commercial value from a biotech and a pharma company. So there are different models addressing different issues, so to speak.
Are there any other challenges? One of the questions when you open up IPR in these collaborations, so one thing is securing the ability of biotech companies, other collaborators to appropriate the rents from their investments in R&D. But are there any other challenges that you've experienced? I imagine it's a different kind of legal agreement you enter into when you work together, or it involves trust as well. As you said, there's a high degree of trust involved in knowing that your knowledge is safe and that you are in a collaboration where you can engage freely and openly. Are these or any other challenges something you've encountered in your efforts to open up your collaboration?
So one of the main issues by opening up your view on IPR is actually internal. Because when you work in a big company, a fairly large company, and you work in an industry that is used to working in certain ways, it's difficult to make changes into that process. So therefore, internally, it's difficult to change how we work with IPR. And you have to kind of overcome that first in order to then open up and make the changes to an external partner. And that was actually one of the most difficult parts. But I think I'm going to come back to you have to realize that you do this because there's a need for it. And the need will be to establish a trustworthy, respectful, and mutual beneficial relationship with your partner. That is what you have to do. And for us, it happens to be the IPR is a major issue for that. And for us, we don't need to deal with the IPR. So we kind of push that to the side and saying, with any kind of IPR you have, that's up to you. We won't even touch that. So that's how we deal with it. But if you start dealing with IPR, it is difficult when you start to thinking about who owns what and who has the rights and do we have joint ownership. And actually joint ownership is actually more difficult because then no one can make a decision. So actually we start up having a joint sharing of the data, but that made it difficult for the biotech who got the data to go to an investor and say, hey, we can actually use this data, because then they need our permission to use that data because it was partly owned by us. So when you start to talk about who owns what in data and APR, it gets really difficult. Yeah. So my suggestion is to keep that away as far as possible, if you can, of course. But it's a big question.
You're saying it was a big change as well for Leo Pharma to be opening up and changing its way of thinking.
But yes, we open up, but that is, again, I said, to some extent, as part of the big process. But then we say, when you come over to this side, then we have to address it as we normally do.
Exactly.
And so we haven't changed the entire thing.
Also, if you look at across all areas of business, which specific areas are you opening up? I mean, can you say a few words about, is it molecule testing, is PPI research, or at which stages is it possible and interesting for you to open up, and when do you close the doors again?
Actually, I see someone done the homework. And that's a good question, because the open innovation platform that I work with and has designed actually can do all those things and more. And so we started by opening up in order to make it work with biotechs, make it work with startups, and make it work with spin-outs. And spin-outs and startups has become really, really important for us, because they usually have some key technical competence, maybe from a university lab. They created something, and then they see a commercialization opportunity, or that maybe how to create value for the pharma industry, and they then lack the knowledge on how to make that happen. So when they would come to a traditional pharma company, they would be met by closed doors saying, come back when you have clinical data. And then I say, we can't, because we had no one to work with, right? So that's a catch-22 problem. And here we say, if you don't have the data, well, come on in and we see if we can help you create the data. So we can test those molecules. And we can say, and then they get the information, and we can give feedback on how they behave in our view. So we also provide industry feedback on how they behave in our labs, which is of a great value for a spin-out and a startup. And then also, for education, I think we'd like to help educate our future employees and the future workforce. And here's an opportunity to use open innovation in that manner. We work with a couple of universities around the world, and it's actually started with DTU, where we offer medicinal chemistry students insight to a pipeline and drug targets and chemistry, and then they're being taught by expert chemists in the labs how to make new drugs based on drugs that exists. And then they go to the lab and make these molecules for real, and then they send them to our labs, and we test them and give the results back to the students. And this is an undergraduate level, mass students, at a couple of universities, and they say this is unheard of. And actually, the professor, he said, not only do we actually get to test our molecules that we make, usually we just make them, we also get to get them tested by someone who knows what they're doing. Yeah. And that closeness that we can create with making education work closer to the industry is not valuable right now, but it's going to be really, really valuable in the near future when those people come out in the job market and going to work with us, already having the competence and the skills, the science and expertise work for us. So I think that's a way going forward for the pharma industry. And here I think we can look and learn at the software industry, where perhaps you can use GitHub as a social coding platform, right? You can show what you can by contributing to open source programming tasks. Similar things, I think, can be applied in the pharma industry. Yeah. And this is one example of how that could get started. And yes, we also do molecule testing and PPI research. And PPI stands for protein-protein interactions. We try to disrupt the interaction between two big proteins with a small molecule in between. We do that as well. And if you have some ideas, come to us.
On that note, actually, we have time for one final question. That'll be from me. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that some pharmaceutical companies, other than Leo Pharma, are starting to move towards more open collaboration. And you can definitely tell when you've been following the industry for many years, there is, a change brewing in how you're working. What would be your parting words of advice for any startup, a smaller company that wishes to engage with the pharmaceutical industry and wants to get into this open part of the innovation ecosystem, what is the most important thing to approach the pharmaceutical companies and to get in the door, essentially?
Yeah, good question. And first of all, I agree completely. The industry is starting to open up, realizing we need to get access to external innovation. They will use terminology and phrasing and words that you not might be used to, but they will look ways to leverage external innovation. And for you to potentially engage with those things, it could be in early discovery, it could be clinical research, it could be digitalization, it could be patient interactions, it could be finding the right treatment for the right patient, the precision medicine, lots of aspects. My recommendation is to get out there. Go check out the pharmaceuticals industry's websites. Merck, Boehringer Ingelheim, Sanofi, AstraZeneca. There's a lot of them out there who's starting to work with open innovation in different ways. Some more advanced than others. But a common trait is they usually try to provide something. And you can get hold of resources, you can get hold of information, you can get hold of clear problems that they need solved. And as I mentioned before, the most critical aspect of innovation is understanding value creation. So get out there and look what the industry needs more than ever. Then you'll be able to navigate to see if you can fill that hole by using the resources they make available in different ways nowadays. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is an opportunity and it's something that's going to grow even more going forward.
On that note, thank you, Niclas. So the future of innovation in the pharmaceutical industry is open, and thank you for showing us a path ahead, and we'll follow and see how it goes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the great questions, everyone.
Thanks.